First of all, I want to thank you all for coming. It's really important to us that these events have a consistent and robust crowd every night. We started this workshop, which we called Real Matter, because we, as architects, we're aware of the fact that a lot of things that are happening in our city are not as good as they should be, that architects have a role to play in that, and not presenting ourselves as perfect in any way. In fact, if you were here last night, I kind of threw myself under the bus, which is true. Really just wanting to talk about what it's like to be an architect, what it's like to live in this city, the challenges we face, what it's like to try to get good work done. And this panel tonight, which is a panel of architects from the area, all of whom practice from very different perspectives, is really an opportunity to turn the conversation from what we were talking about last night into kind of a conversation about practice and the role of the architect in the city. And so we're really excited about that. All of you are here tonight for a panel discussion. You might not know exactly why these events are happening, and I wanted to say just a little bit about that. We've organized over the last 8 months a workshop, and this workshop is lasting 2 weeks. We've invited students from across the Southeast to apply. It was a selective application process. We admitted a certain number. We had a certain number to come. I'll talk about that in a second. And they're here for 2 weeks doing an intense design charrette in downtown Raleigh, studying the city. Most of them are not from here, so they're studying the city through unpolluted eyes. This is a new place to them. They're not mixed in with the politics. They're not already shackled by some of the things that I deal with every day because I'm from here. And so they're studying the city for 2 weeks, identifying issues that are happening in the city, and then proposing projects and going to execute those by the end of next week. We'll have all that work on display publicly at some point. We'll just keep you all informed about that. The lecture series and panel series started as a curriculum for them, as kind of a crash course to learn about this place, and then eventually later in the series to hear lectures by really accomplished architects who have kind of a social bent to their work. And as we move towards the end when they're executing their projects, a couple of architects who are just really, really talented designers, right? So there's kind of an arc to the whole thing. And we made it public, and it's kind of taken on a life of its own with wonderful attendance, really vital discussions, and it's something we're really excited about. We do want to do this every year. We plan to do this every year. And so this is the first run. There were some real hiccups, nights 1 and 2. There'll probably be something that happens tonight. It hadn't happened yet. Cross my fingers. But it's been a great experience so far. I do want to introduce the cohort that's here. The 17 students who are here from 6 different states and 8 different universities. I think they're all sitting here in the front. If y'all want to stand up real quick. Yeah, no, you hate this part. They're already hard at work. I think they're even more tired than we are. So thanks for being here. I do just a few things about that. You guys all took a risk to even apply in the first place. COVID was still raging. We had no idea if this thing was even going to happen. The whole thing was kind of an act of faith. Thankfully, we were very fortunate in the timing with how this has worked out. And we're glad you're here and glad you followed through on it. These guys also paid tuition to be here, which is one of 2 things that has helped support all of these events. So we appreciate that part as well. Maybe, a round of applause for that. The other thing that has enabled this to happen is an incredible amount of community support. The slideshow that was running before we got started here and the banners recognized 19 sponsors who have all given either in-kind donations or money to make this possible. One of the things we feel very fortunate about as a firm is we work in an incredible city with an incredible design community, and instead of fighting with each other, we support each other. And many of the names on that poster are firms we compete with every day, which has been absolutely humbling to have the support of people that we work alongside, is a nicer way to say it. So we really appreciate that support. There are also over 100 people who've been involved with this and will be involved with this, helping us teach studio, helping us lead tours, sitting on panels, you name it, to make this possible, including the staff here at Transfer who've been amazing kind of behind the scenes. I'll probably leave it at that. I do want to just introduce these folks briefly, and I'll let Sarah, our moderator, kind of take over. Oh, one other thing, the conversation last night. So we have a plan of how we think this is going to go tonight, which only exists in case no one out there does anything, right? Out in the audience. We really want this to be a discussion, and I think everybody up here is game for folks to kind of chime in whenever they want to. I know that each of these folks is going to introduce each other and show an image or two and kind of give you some ideas to talk to. But after that, it should be a vital discussion. We had to shut it down at 8:45 last night after a pretty raucous time. So no pressure, but we hope this night is just as good. We've invited these folks to come be on the panel tonight, mainly because we don't have an agenda for this, and we certainly don't want to have a leading voice because we don't know what we're doing either. But we're excited about the 6 people up here. They all have really vibrant practices that are all very different from each other. I'll let them introduce themselves, but we appreciate your time doing this, and I have all the respect in the world for what y'all are doing. I'll turn it over to Sarah Queen with that, and we'll get started. Thanks.
Should I introduce us first, in case it falls apart? I think I can handle that. I'm Sarah Queen. It's nice to be here. I'm an architect and a professor at NC State. I have Edwin Harris to this side. He is a co-founder and principal of Evoke Studio in Durham, does beautiful, excellent work, award-winning practice. Edwin, beyond leading a practice, is really committed, I think, to education in a broad sense. He teaches as a professor of practice. He mentors elementary, middle, high schoolers, educates his clients, was also a project architect at the Freelon Group, Perkinson Will, designer. He's young. Ellen Weinstein. Ellen Weinstein is a principal at Weinstein Friedland in Durham. Also amazing, beautiful work. I think when I think of Ellen, I just think of beautiful things, beautiful objects that are thoughtful in their place. One awesome thing about Ellen is she has a background in landscape architecture before she came to architecture, which I think really informs how she thinks about not just the buildings, but the space between buildings, the fabric of our cities. She's also a professor of practice and a mentor of mine as an educator as well as an architect. We have Eliza Montgomery. She is a principal founder of Montgomery Cho here in Raleigh. She's a native of Raleigh and recently returned last few years, worked in New York for many years before coming back, does a wide range of work in her practice now, and is taught at Pratt and the New School. Hopefully, we'll get you at NC State, the College of Design soon. Jake Heffington, his practice is, so it's got a funny name.
I don't usually tell people the names.
I wrote it down. And Other Works, principal, founder. Jake was at In Situ for many years as a project architect. He is also a professor of architecture, professor of practice at the School of Architecture. He has recently created and gotten, you're on the board, of Diversify Architecture, which I think is a phenomenal program, really challenging and pushing who is in architecture, who are in the professions that are informing the built environment, and how we need to push who that is and diversify who that is, starting with middle school and high schoolers. And last but not least, we have Patrick Hobgood, who is a principal and an architect at Hobgood Architects here in Raleigh. They do a lot of beautiful local projects as well as projects all around the globe. Patrick spent many years at OMA's office before returning to Raleigh, has also taught and been a critic across the country at a variety of great schools. So that's who we are. We're really excited for you guys to be here tonight. We hope this discussion will be a great follow-up to the last few nights and the topics that were raised, the items that were raised. We also hope that we'll inspire us as a group to think about the scales of impact and the influence that we have as designers on our built environment, to think about the responsibilities we have to educate our clients and to advocate for progressive policy that influences how the built environment works. And hopefully we'll leave tonight with some tactics for engaging wider participation and a broader discussion about how our city develops for all of us. The challenges and opportunities for design and architecture and urbanism are so large, but they're also experimental to some extent, right? Often we don't understand the full impacts of the changes that we make in the built environment for years or decades after they were done. Another sort of item that came up in our discussion last night was that many of the challenges for Raleigh as a mid-sized city in America are universal to many mid-sized cities, but there are also things that are unique to this place, to our ecological heritage, our cultural heritage, our political and social climate. So how do we make a place that's unique to here, and we don't erase what's here with the generic that's everywhere? What does that mean? How do we do that? How do we build that? When we talk about development tonight, and we talk about how the city's changing and building, we're not just talking about buildings and architecture, but we're talking about development that happens across scales, right? So the small scale ADU incremental incisions in our fabric that build density or offer alternative housing sources, or the bus stops that were mentioned last night, the design of them, the removal of other ones, but because of the design, the cost of fabrication, they're not sort of going up where they're going up. We also are talking about the open space, not just public open space for recreation, but also open space for habitat, ecological habitat functions. And then lastly, sort of large systems understanding of the infrastructure that sustains and catalyzes our growth. So we didn't want you, when we start to say development, to just think about multifamily housing, multi-block, the big things that we think about with that word. I think with that, I'm ready to turn it over to some of our panels. If you can hit the next button, Eliza. We've got some slides to dig deeper into some topics to spark conversation today. So Jake's our first one.
That's great. I didn't know that. So I'm Jake. Yeah, so quick background intro. This image is, for me, this was my first experience really being thoughtful about architecture. It was long before I considered architecture as a profession. I was studying as a student of anthropology and philosophy. It's my undergraduate degree, and happened to be invited on an archaeological dig in Jordan. So this is in Jalul, Jordan. And you're looking at the dig site and the former home of a 4,000-odd-year-old community of desert dwellers. It's a really amazing experience. There's a lot of stories there that were really impactful in a lot of different ways. But what's relevant tonight, I think, is in how it shaped my sort of understanding of architecture and my approach, and what it means that we can study something like archaeology and learn about a people. Archaeology is a pretty remarkable field, and one of the reasons that that's so true is when we're studying a culture, we're studying their value systems. We're studying their priorities. We're studying their social and economic systems, their political structures, all of these things. And in the case of communities that are as old as this one, we're doing that exclusively based on their material remnants. It's only the physical realities that they left behind that we have as evidence of what they did and believed and thought and pursued as a society, how they organized themselves, how they structured their communities, etc. The fact that we can learn all of those things only from these remnants gives us kind of a clue, I think, as designers and architects, that if we can put on a sort of archaeological, anthropological hat and view the spaces around us now, we can get some pretty interesting insight into what our priorities are as a community. You don't have to be an architect to do this. Anybody can walk around, observe the way that design is implemented across any city, and start to understand where their priorities lie. That's crazy. So the question that Jalul continually brings up to me today is, when our community looks like Jalul sometime in the distant future when the alien race that has destroyed us is like studying us and trying to understand what we did and what we thought, what are they going to think about the socioeconomic structures of Raleigh-Durham? How are they going to understand the political structures of Raleigh-Durham? If they don't have our texts, they all got burned up in the ray guns. All they've got is our built environment, our structures, our open space. What are they going to think about who we are and who we were and what we believed? That is a crazy thought when you're partially responsible for designing the built environment. We have this kind of responsibility to leave an imprint, our fingerprints, all over the built world that then influences the way that we live, and also that is imbued with the values of our culture and society. Crazy. Really, really weird to think about. That's where I came into architecture from. I was actually more studying cultural anthropology, which is sort of different than archaeology, but there's a lot of overlap. I think we can probably go to the next one. Yeah, so when we put on our archaeological, our anthropological hats and we walk around the city, we can start to sort of analyze, okay, what are the things that we care about? When we go into our public spaces, what are the things that we want? What are the activities we want to occur there? Who do we want to invite into those spaces and who do we want to exclude? And on every scale, you can start to see these little implementations of a design process that has exposed us. It's exposed the building class as a community and as a culture. So a couple of these examples, and I've heard rumor that some of these came up last night, which is great, would be like this bench that's probably in the best napping spot in the city of Raleigh. It's like a beautiful shaded under a tree in a garden, sort of adjacent to a park. Would be an amazing napping spot. And the bench is designed to repel sleepers, people who need to sleep in public spaces. Feels like a problem. Maybe it's a problem. It at least feels like a value. It's kind of exposed something about the building class. This example down here is obviously, repelling skateboarders, repelling a certain kind of culture and attitude, or whatever you want to call that. There are buildings adjacent to downtown, in downtown, on the edge of downtown, that not so subtly sort of flip off low-income communities that are around them. We have a courthouse plaza that is about as inviting as a jail cell in a non-ironic sort of way. These are all things that we can look at as sort of investigators, as anthropologists, and say, okay, what can we learn about ourselves and our culture? When we turn that hat around and it's got the architect logo on there, or the designer logo, or the policymaker logo, then we can say, okay, well, what's the sort of value set that we want to be putting into our built environment? Oh, you got a hand up? Uh-huh. Yeah, great question. We all probably have a different answer for that because we all work at really different scales and doing different things. The question was, what are we doing as architects? And I can't answer for everybody. I can give you examples of what I'm doing right now, and maybe that's helpful, and maybe that's not. Should we go into that, or should we move on and come back to that? Sarah, what's the protocol here?
There is no protocol. You can answer yours, and then we'll keep going, and then we'll
let everybody answer theirs. Yeah.
I'm gonna jot that down though to come back to. Okay.
Yeah. What was your name?
Sunga. S-U-N-G-U-H.
Sunja. Sunga. Okay. Yeah. So for me, I think the project that is most along those lines is actually sort of just getting started. And Steve's in here. Steve was in the meeting the other day. I'm soon to be working with a nonprofit in East Raleigh to help them imagine what a 25,000 square foot, which is a pretty big building, community anchor would look like in an area that's gentrifying really fast, that would allow community members that still exist or that still live in those communities to maintain connection, maintain their social network within that community. That's like an example that I can give of a project that the goal is to sort of maintain the community that exists, to prioritize the values of the existing community, rather than what we see most often in development, or very often, which is looking more toward attracting a different kind of community than supporting the community that exists today.
Why leave it at maintain and not uplift?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. That's a better way to put it. Love it. Okay, so yeah, we can go to the next one. Just try to move through this. Yeah. So I do think, and I'm sure we'll hear different perspectives on this tonight, but I do think that as a design community, we have an opportunity, because we have influence to spend, to change the way that things are going. We don't always get to decide our projects. That's definitely true. There are much larger powers that be, but we're in the room, and we're the ones who are putting pen to paper. So we do have this sort of opportunity, but we have to acknowledge that architecture goes beyond building science, and it goes beyond design as an aesthetic sort of pursuit. We have to start acknowledging architecture as a social science as well. I think that's really important for us as we move forward and as we start thinking about what the future of our city is. That's a really important point. So when we see things like protesters marching in the street, skateboarders using our awkward building forms to do cool, rad tricks, people illegally gathering in an effort to reclaim public space for the public sphere, and then I'll get to that image in a second. We can celebrate, and we should celebrate, and I think collectively we do celebrate, but we should also feel pretty uncomfortable, because we have a role in this, and we have a role in creating the sort of spaces that people who feel the need to do these things should be thriving in. This, I think, is one of the most poetic images that came out of 2020 for Raleigh. It's the Confederate statue that was dragged to the courthouse right in front of the doors that was shown in the last image, and just left on the steps, and it was there all night. There was something really beautiful about that to me, which we can talk about maybe later. But and then just to end, and I'll wrap up. It's definitely longer than a minute. Oh, can you go to the next one? Sorry, this is the last one. I think we can do better as a community, for sure, but I also think that there are some cases where we are doing better. So Durham tends to be maybe ahead of the curve, ahead of Raleigh in this in a lot of ways, which in my mind says, okay, Raleigh, we should just copy, like steal the ideas and advance them. This is a great example, though, that Vines was able to design the Durham County Library. It's a beautiful project. This is a render just because it was the highest resolution image I could find, but it looks exactly like this. You can look at pictures later. It's beautiful. It's public, it's for the communities that we need to be supporting, uplifting, inspiring, moving forward in all of our communities. And it kind of leaves you with the question, why doesn't Raleigh have a prominent public library that's easily accessible? Like, what a silly thing for even a moderately sized city to not have. So we can kind of ruminate on all those questions maybe throughout the evening, but that's it for me.
Okay. All right, so I think the slide says what I feel and the way we practice, and it's really about the ethos of our practice. It's not just branding. It's not just for this. It's really, truly, we build for people, we consider people, and what we do is essentially, I think the work that we create, most of our work is public. The non-public work that we do is for the general public. But what we do is really, I think we really just reflect what our community is telling us in the architecture. And so, all these photos here, I think Sunga, is that your name? So you asked the question about what are we doing, and I think that's a fair question. I think it would take me easily 3 hours to answer it fully, but I will say most of my career has been dedicated to that. And there's different ways to go about doing it, right? And so I think for us, it has been trying to include more people who don't necessarily have the access or even just the knowledge of what the design world is to the profession of design, period, not just architecture, but design, and understanding really how important that is, because as designers, we have an amazing amount of influence and impact. And I think really kind of starting early and like exposing people to that, it's been something that's really been valuable to us. But also just, again, we get to choose the type of work that we want to do sometimes, right? So Jake was right. Not every project do you get to choose, but we definitely choose what work we won't work on, right? So like, we don't do strip malls, we won't do prisons, we won't do certain things because I just fundamentally just don't feel right about doing those things. And so I think that's part of the question, or part of the answer, or part of my response. And if you go to the next slide, this is just some of the work. It's not to show anything other than the work is very intentional, which hopefully most architects are. I like to think that we're really aggressive. We're aggressive, and I use that word intentionally, but we also are intentionally expressive, not of our values, but of who we're building for, their values. And so what I would encourage, any designers or anyone, period, is don't sell yourself short in terms of the amount of power that you have. I think as architects, we do wield a lot of power in terms of influence, and we can throw things out that clients or communities have never thought about, and then they pick up that kind of idea and run with it, or they give us ideas and we run with it. And so I think just in general, just the idea of being aggressive about trying to improve our environment and our world and our community is what I would leave with. So I think the next person is next.
Thank you. Don't want to get you tangled up. So we all depend on our clients. Now, some days, I'll be honest, I go home and I wish maybe we could do it just without our clients, and it would be much simpler and we'd get it done faster. Certainly would not be as good or as rich. And many of us here, our architects in the group and the will-be architects in the group, work with folks who I would define as people, or our clients are people who build buildings for a living. They may be developers, they may be the universities, community college, the city, the state, the federal government, all have offices of, facilities management, the campus architect's office, et cetera. And I think those folks do a great job. They're in the business of building buildings. We have been fortunate to be able to work for a lot of folks who are not in the business of building buildings. They tend to be nonprofit groups, church communities, and other folks who we are guiding them through that process of building a building. And they make very different decisions. They can make very different decisions because they're not building something to sell it to somebody else who's going to sell it to somebody else who's going to sell it to somebody else. The project I show up here is the Durham co-housing community in Durham Central Park. It is an urban co-housing community, so it's by law, it's a condominium. But this project, and so as architects, we could talk about our buildings for a long time. But to me, this project is important really for the people that you see in the picture below. These people came together. They are downtown enthusiasts, and starting about 10 years ago, they started looking for a site to create an intentional community. And it took them a while, and they gathered. They were up to 8 or 9 folks, and then 2 people dropped out, and then they got another couple. But they grew this group, and they found a site, and they hired an architect. And to me, these are the heroes of this story. They figured out how to be their own developers and to develop their own community. About half of this building is, I'll say, common spaces that they share, and half of the building are individual units. So it's not a commune. They all have their own front doors and individual units, but they figured out how to do it. And they figured out how to do it, I think, in a very sustainable way. So many of them moved from suburban or in-town houses and downtown neighborhoods and chose to create an intentional community and figured out how to work with the banks and how to work through us with planning and zoning and all of those things. So they're the hero of the story. And just one more slide. For many, when we think about the process of design, these folks were involved from, again, finding the site, finding their architect. We worked with them in various workshops and charrettes to design their individual dwelling units, to think about the building as a whole on the site and what it contributed to downtown and to the urban environment. So really worked with them at all scales. And, we can think, well, God, what a nightmare. How, you got to get 40 people to all come together. But, there are lots of systems, lots of ways to get people to listen to each other and to basically vote and figure out. And if you'll see the dots, a lot of folks agree that they don't want this one and they don't want that one, but they can agree on this one. And it's just been a really incredible experience to work with communities like this. And we didn't learn our lesson. We're working on a second co-housing community that's under construction. And it's just really wonderful to work with people who are creating their own place in the city.
So I think that's a great segue into something I wanted to talk about tonight. So in my practice that I have with my partner, Will Choi, we design buildings, but we also really care about, I feel like architects have a role in facilitating discussions between all different types of people, helping people understand the different constraints in projects, in city design, in and also the different sort of incentives that all the different players have in a given project. So one of the projects that we did right before the pandemic is called Block Party. And basically, we took the premise that city design is extremely complicated. It's influenced by so many things: politics, economics, transportation, culture, environment. Some of these factors we as designers and as community members, we can have an impact on. Other things are much larger, systematic issues that will take decades to change. But they all have an impact on city design and how it develops over time. So we wanted to design a little workshop that would allow people to understand all these complexities. We invited participants to take a blank block and we asked them to design their ideal block of the city. There was a collection of different little building types. There was all different types of residences, apartment buildings, single-family houses, low-income housing. There was other public buildings like hospitals and museums. There was infrastructure, bus stops, and even power plants and prisons, all the different components that a city needs. Some of them is very desirable to live near these things. You might want it on your block. Some of them you might not want on your block, but it's still really important to have in the city. We need it to make the city run, to make the city work. So throughout the night, participants came. The ones who came at the beginning had an advantage in a way because they had a big range of different building types to choose from. We purposefully limited the number of each building type based on how much a certain population could sort of accept. And so the people at the beginning had an advantage. They could design a really nice block. They could put it wherever they wanted in the city. The people who came at the end had to work with what was left. They had to be more creative, and they had to, they were left with the spaces in the city, the only ones that were left. So in a way, this reflects the reality that we experience in city design here. So, I think the goal of the project was really to get people to understand the equity as a fluid process, and it happens over many different decisions that are made over time. And we're really excited to do this little workshop, and we hope to do more of them in the future to help people understand all these complexities and hopefully allow them to make better decisions, work with each other better, share ideas easier, and result in better projects being developed and built in the city. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, this is a singular kind of specific example, though. When I think about Raleigh, because I grew up here, and then I lived away from Raleigh for a long time, and I came back maybe about 8 years ago. And for the most part, the influx of people moving here, I mean, these are all huge feathers in our cap, right? That we're getting people from other places, other cultures, we're getting downtown density. We're growing at a rapid pace, but I think most people in this room would agree that the growth is fairly generic. So there's a couple reasons we could talk about later why that is. But there's also, I feel like, and maybe this is an education thing, or there's also, I feel like, a lack of embrace of what's here. I mean, not obviously, this room probably knows where all the good buildings are in Raleigh, but the general public, I don't think. So this is one example of a project where a property owner called, told us what he was looking for, a new 70,000 square foot office building. There was a building there, he didn't want to keep it. I didn't recognize the address. This was on Glenwood Avenue, kind of as you're going from here to Crabtree Valley Mall. When we got out there, we noticed, well, this is one of Mill Small's buildings, who was a really well-renowned modernist architect in Raleigh in the 50s. The next slide. We talk about what gets saved, what gets erased. This building, when it was built, this is a Sunday Times, above the fold, front page. There's one of a building that was in Raleigh. That should be reason enough. 1965, great design. So the whole strategy was how to save that building through tax credits, through finding potential tenants. If you go to the next slide. Was in there, this was actually after the client fired us, but then we reached out to reached out to the newspaper, trying to bring more awareness. George Smart, NC Modernist, had a function out there. We tried our scheme, which at first, if you go to the next slide, he kind of liked, but then I think after we tried to keep the old building, there's a big courtyard cut out of it, because the problem was the building was doubled at some point for when the insurance company grew, so it was a huge floor slab. It got no natural light, and he couldn't lease it out easily when the pediatrics was there, but not pediatrics, orthopedics was there, yeah, forever. And when they moved out, he couldn't lease it because you couldn't subdivide it well. So we cut a hole out of the middle, and then the additional 35,000 square feet, we tried to put a top, above the building. We worked with builders to get the cost down. If you go to when we pitched it, he was like, "Whoa, that's weird, maybe." And then he came back a week later, angry, and fired us. And then he said, this is what I want. And that's what's built there. That's what's there today when you go by there. That building is that great building, which gave a lot of fabric, even if you didn't go into that building, just as visual beauty in our city was gone. So. I don't know. Last night I was here. I loved the discussion last night. I thought there was a lot of great things. I feel like, and to a certain extent, as architects, though, the culture in America for architecture and design, we're often the last people to the table. The site's been bought, the program's set, the budget's set, and like Edwin said and some other people, that you can try to bring more to it, but the fact of the matter is, if somebody wants 10 townhomes, that's what you're designing. Or you could choose to take the project or not take the project, and there's a discussion there. But I think what I really long for, now that we're seeing Raleigh in this kind of renaissance moment, is for less generic development, more thoughtful design, more design that attaches to communities and helps communities and can service the kind of general public as well as the people that live there. And there's nothing that I'm aware of yet that we can really point to as an example of that. So that's the conundrum, I guess, we're in. That's a negative note to end it on. But
Well, I think as a starting question, how do we start that process? What are the strategies to get us at the table quicker? Which of those are our responsibility to sort of pave the road for? And how do we, as designers and architects, challenge the value system that Jake was exposing that we might observe in our built environment to be something different? So that's a question for here and there.
I'll start. I think in some ways you kind of have to play into the greed, because I mean that is what it is, right? This is more profitable. You can lease it out, so it makes sense. So you play into the greed, and we've seen it, at least in our practice so far, where clients are starting to become more sensitive to what the general public wants, in terms of they realize that the general public is starting to actually really appreciate design. They're starting to appreciate not being completely generic and specificity. And so the branding of being able to present something different and something fresh has actually been really advantageous for us. And so I think, obviously not every client cares about this, but I think the more of a groundswell that can kind of build where people are asking for something that's specific and authentic, the better. And then for us as architects, like I said, for me, I think, you all lost the battle, in terms of that building, but I think continually kind of having that patience and the resilience to keep putting it out there, even if it's going to fail. We have a hell of a lot of failures, but we're proud of them still because it does push the envelope, and it may change that thought process moving forward. You hope that it does start to, influence it, but I think in my mind, that's the beginning of kind of how we can kind of change it.
Go ahead.
I have a question. So the reality is that this is what the public thinks architecture is. They don't see the steps that lead up to the very interesting design, the unique builds, the fact that conversations are being had about how are we best serving the public. So how does the profession communicate to the public we're more than just this?
That's a good question. I mean, I would think, like, if you look at other countries, other cultures, they do a much better job of kind of educating. First of all, like, design is part of, like, elementary school curriculum in most European countries. It's like there with English and other, like, there's an understanding already. There's a lot more history also, so that it's just visible. They can see the progression of design through history just in their towns. There's also, like, public, the system in America, at least from my perspective, is really kind of rigged. Like, if you want, like Edwin mentioned, the public projects, I think that for every architect is the best project. I mean, anything that's general public is using, people that occupy the space are using, but you're coming into a broad contact. Let's say we've also done a lot of houses, that serves 2 to 5 people. They're the only people, so I think every architect wants to be in the public realm. In America, you have RFP, RFQs, and that you're submitting for student housing or a hospital, whatever, any public project, and you need to show 10 other of that typology. As opposed to many European countries, there's open competitions. So you don't have to have any experience. You could take the time, take the risk, put a project together for a gymnasium or an elementary school or a community center. And those projects are judged on the design merit, not what's in the portfolio. So you see a lot more young practices in other parts of the world that are doing well because there's more opportunity. Because it is a complicated story. It's a very collaborative thing. Each of us represent a lot of people that we work with to make it possible. And I don't think that I think people just see the final product, or they don't know what else is available, or what other places have done, and the success of those things. So I think an easy answer would be just education, and people understanding design a little bit better and the impacts of design. Like as Jake pointed out, so many things people wouldn't even consider can have a very negative impact on how people use space or gather in space. So you need good examples to kind of also people to understand and see.
All right. Brock.
Yeah, on that note, Patrick, I think the question of form is an interesting one, or style. It's interesting, but I think we have to take the question a little bit further, broader. Because the previous building with 5 Milton Small is a wonderful example of international modernism, but it was really a part of racialized topography of Raleigh, development of Northwest Raleigh as a white suburban landscape. It was part of its infrastructure with insurance and suburban development, police departments, and so on. So in some ways, that building and this building are not that different. Just in terms of style, yes, but in terms of what they accomplish and what they represent, they are not that different. I think we have to ask the question of, how do we rethink the racial topography of the city and what how accessible these buildings are and who they represent and who they benefit. So I want to just kind of broaden the question there.
I have a thing to say. I think that's a great way to broaden that question, and one of the key issues that we're dealing with as a national architecture community right now is that the folks who are at the table, architects, developers, financiers, city planners, anybody who sits on committees, they're pretty much white. And that ends up being a problem for all sorts of reasons. One of the big ones is, if we kind of jump back to the first slide there, like if our design work and our building work and what we develop as a culture ties into your cultural values and understanding, then any group that's excluded from that process, their culture isn't represented in the built environment. Their values aren't represented in the built environment. Their needs typically aren't met by the built environment. Their dreams and aspirations and ambitions aren't supported by the built environment. So this isn't a full answer to the question, but it is something that I think we have to reckon with, and that's who is at the table? Who's sitting around talking about these things? Who's putting pen to paper? Is it somebody who has a vested interest in the communities that are being affected, or is it somebody who is, I think when we've talked about this a little bit earlier, architecture is a patron based profession, and that we have a client and we're serving that client. But I do think we have an opportunity, and maybe responsibility is a better word there, to consider the community our first patron, our first client, the broader community, the existing community. Every building, every intervention that we make really needs to be a part of a fabric that exists and benefit and enhance the livelihoods of people who are in that space already. The problem that we have right now is about 88% of the people in that space represent one community. And it's more nuanced than that, but until we have, as an architecture community and as a community of developers, folks who can truly say, they're from and have a vested interest in X community, the Latinx community, it's really hard to, it's possible to a degree, but it's really hard to truly represent the interests of that group. So when we look back through the history of America, this is going to come as a big surprise, but white people have pretty much been in charge for most of it. And there's been no difference in architecture than in any other profession. And there are systematic issues that have created the environment for that and that propel it. But I think we're kind of at a reckoning point now, and especially in the last few years with the political climate, where we have to come to terms with that as a profession and consider and I love the term racialized topographies, if that's something that we're going to deal with in our current state, we need to make some big changes as a profession. It's not an answer to the question, I guess.
And I think it's sort of polite to say that it's just about who's been at the table, but there's also been aggressive motives behind the way that the built environment has been developed, who's developed it, the policies behind it, and our role in that that's been aggressively oppressive to many groups. So it's more than just sort of who's been at the table. It's also been the sort of motives and objectives behind the way that the built environment has been done, which is something that we have to reckon with.
Yeah, do you maybe just also, like, if you look at Raleigh right now, like the population, the age groups that are moving here, you can see like the result, like everybody, I'm not here to like defend developers, but it's very black and white what they do. You know, I don't think there's any surprise. They look for places that are starting to boom. They'll swoop in. They'll drop an apartment building, the cheapest form of construction with as max out stick construction on top of a couple of concrete parking garages. And they come in, they make easy $30 million and they get out. You know, they're not from here. They're not investing. It's like the stock market for them. So I'm not surprised what's happening. I wish there was a bit more like public backlash, you know, because all of the things that are being built today are going to be here for all of our lifetimes, and they're not taking into fact what communities are around them. You know, they're just maxing out the footprint, the maximum leasable space, which again, that's their job to do. You know, like I don't know. I can't speak for everybody, but I know the office I work for in New York, we did work for developers, high-end towers in different parts of the world sometimes. I didn't see that as like an evil thing. I just saw it as like a market-driven capitalism, and that they knew that if they hired a celebrity architect, they'd get more on their lease. You know, it wasn't. It's just a sad kind of state of how development works. That's a private sector thing. Those are people coming in making money. You know, I hope there's more people that develop locally, that are from places, and they say this is what used to be here. This is what. You know, just on my street alone, it's a historic African American community. They're buying up properties and, you know, putting bigger houses there. You know, like when I talk to my neighbors, it's like, oh, that house right there had the biggest tree where all the kids hung out and they gave it the most shade. So-and-so lived there. You know, there's actually the reason why that yard grows green grass is there's a well there that they buried when they rebuilt that house. And you know, they're just dropping on things, and there's no sense of history. You know, I agree. You know, we can judge how it was in the 50s and the mindset. I totally agree and understand what you're saying, Barack. But at the same time, I also feel like we have to just preserve some things that make Raleigh, Raleigh. You know, that are quirky or unique, or, you know, there's such a rush to just build. Let's get the tax dollars in here as soon as possible. So I think there's a lot of bad examples, but, you know, we can also point to good examples of development in Raleigh. I think Dix Park will be a great park for everybody. And the amount of public outreach, you know, I've never seen anything like that the people, everyone's voice is heard, and there's forums, and there's mini groups and big sessions. So, you know, Moore Square was brought up last night. There's probably no fans of Moore Square in here, I would assume. I'm not a fan of what happened to Moore Square, just even for the lack of shade that was taken out. But there are cases where the city will, you know, do something that's, you know, that's going to be great for us as we kind of expand and grow. So, you know, it's taking the good with the bad, I guess, and just being aware of what's happening too is a big part of it.
Jen, you had your hand up for a while, I think.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Sarah. I was just, thank you. I was going to say that your points about capitalism and like the big office towers, I feel like Ellen's point earlier about the cooperative was a really great counterpoint. And I know from personal experience that working with small businesses, working with cooperatives is more work as an architect. And I'm wondering how we can support each other as a community of designers to do more work like that is harder and more time consuming and less billable, so that we don't have to take those big capitalistic projects. Can we talk a little about that?
First, Jen, I would say practice your skills in patience. That's been probably the lesson I've learned the most in working with groups that, again, are not in the business of building buildings, but want to want to be part of saying what happens in their communities. And yeah, it's not a moneymaker as, you know, as an architect. That's been my experience. But it's the kind of work that, you know, we have chosen to do. And yes, we also work for some developers, and it helps feed that. It helps give us some cushion to be able then to work with nonprofits and other groups. So that's, you know, that's my little trick for how I sleep at night when we do work for developers, for profit, et cetera, that we're also able to balance and do other kinds of projects.
And I'll just add, I think also it would be, as a profession, it would be really helpful if we could try and shift to sort of getting all the different players at the table much, much earlier on. Oftentimes, you know, a project or a developer comes up with an idea in a bubble, then, you know, they go to the city, try and get some things passed to make it work. Then they come to the architect as the very last one. They've already like completely imagined the entire thing and figured out, you know, the pro forma and everything. So as architects, you know, we may have a lot of really great ideas of something different to do, but from their perspective, it's too late to consider those things. So I think figuring out ways where we could come together with all those different players at the very beginning before these ideas are generated, before maybe even, you know, property is owned by the developer. I think there's a lot more opportunity then for new ideas and different things.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on something, Patrick, I think you mentioned about in Europe, the model is for education in design at a young age. And I've heard examples here tonight that I think that is part of the solution. To your point, Eliza, about the architects are kind of brought in after all the big decisions are done. One thing that we can continue to do as a design community is engage future clients early and often, from Edwin's mentoring from a young age to your block party, which you talked about how it, you know, well, I think the thing you didn't mention, but what I got out of it is that you're basically teaching people how cities get built. And they kind of learn through that process, and I think that, I hate to use the term education, it's really more about maybe education, so we're not talking down to our clients. And Ellen, your co-housing workshops, all of that is really involving client engagement, future client engagement, teaching them the language of design. And if we can reach them early and often, then maybe those people who are not architects will start thinking along those lines, and they can be their own advocates for design beyond just the professional architects.
Sean, and then in the back. Just the microphone right there.
Hear me? Wondering from anyone on the panel really to hear more about your insights into what we can do as architects. And your projects that you showed sort of gave us a few examples. Still thinking about this image, as Edwin alluded to, that's an asset. That's a financial asset. So as a commission-seeking architect, how do you compete with something that's built as cheaply as possible to absolutely optimize the spreadsheet? But that's also designed, right? That has values embedded in it. Somebody stamped that, right? We have a lifted block. It's opaque. It's fortress-like. You have a buffer with no people in it. It's quiet street, protection for cars. There's so many values, and that's very designed, and somebody stamped that. So I'm just kind of wondering, again, each of you showed some interesting projects, but as practitioners, have you seen any little cracks or insights into what we might do differently as practitioners rather than just simply being commission-seeking architects? I do appreciate what you did, Patrick, trying to preserve an existing structure, whether that structure is problematic or not. Just reusing, rethinking, transforming, I think is one potential strategy. Yeah.
So this is not a shot, Patrick, by any means. So before I proceed, but I do think it's a cop-out to blame developers for all the ills of society in terms of the built environment. I think as architects, it's incumbent on us to say what we can do and what we won't do. and the bills have to be paid, all those things. But you're right, an architect designed this and made this happen. And, you know, we do have some level of free will, and we can choose how much we push and how much we don't push. And you may not get a bunch of leeway, but I think, you know, in my mind, someone could have done better than this. Someone could have been a little bit more specific to this, or more specific and more sensitive to the site, and figured out a way to try to push. I mean, I think that's my kind of own opinion, but I think there are ways to do this. There are some clients who say, look, if you don't have Georgian, I'm not even talking to you, like stylistically, and that is what it is. I mean, it's public universities as well as private, but I do think the more, you know, you don't win every battle. But I think, like I said, for me, the idea of just blaming the developer and saying, you know, we're powerless, that doesn't sit right with me, because I think we're not powerless. I think we have more power than we think we do to be aggressive about it. And I think, to the gentleman's point earlier, like informing the public, but also helping to educate the public on the power of place, and why the built environment matters, why infrastructure matters, beyond just the style of whatever it is that we design, I think would kind of go a long way. And then if we can start to influence policymakers to hold developers accountable in terms of, you build something now, you know, most developers within 5 years, they try to sell it off because they've gotten their money out of it, and then they sell it to someone else, and that person tries to hold on to it for another 5 or 6 years. You know, I think having some policy about how that starts to the, what's the word I'm looking for? Repercussions of just offloading something and building something that's just temporary, I think would help as well, so.
I don't feel like you took a shot. Okay. I mean, I'm not anti-development. I'm not at all. I mean, it's a necessity. You have people moving here, they need places to live, eat, go to school. It has to occur. I'm like you. I want it to be done better, or more thoughtfully, or more bespoke, or, you know.
Well, I would add, you know, you're not alone. I mean, this kind of thing has happened to us as well. You get excited about a client, you show them, and they're excited, and then you get the call in 24 hours, they showed it to this one, and they showed it to that one, and, you know, reality hits. So, you know, sometimes we think we know who we're presenting to and who we're designing for, but we never really know, because then they go and show it. But, you know, when this has happened, the way I find solace with this is that we were not the architects for them, and they were not the clients for us. And there are a lot of people who like this or think they like it. I'm not going to change their minds, you know, from today till tomorrow. So I think it's a really long educational process. I think we each do it every day with every client we meet with. But I think, and I've been doing it, I think, longer than anybody up here. So maybe the one thing that I have learned is we're also choosing clients. You know, we think they're only choosing us, but we have the opportunity, and we're choosing them as well. And so this was not the client for you, I don't think, Patrick, and you are not the architect for them. And I'm not sure that you're going to, you know, convince them in one project. Now, we have taken on work where we, you know, have our one little passion place in the project, and we get excited about that, and the rest is, you know, more regular, I would say, or expected, and then we'll get another opportunity to work for those folks, and we build up a little more confidence with them, and a little bit more confidence until it works. So I think it also just comes from education, and this is what people have, you know, this is what they know, this is what they've seen. So again, back to kind of educating the folks that we work with.
Way back by Jim.
Hey, so I guess I'm going to ask a really short question, and I want really short answers, as short as possible. Maybe from all of you, if possible. Why are there no architects? why are there so few architects who are also developers?
Trying to think of how to minimize my words. I think for me the answer is I don't know. I mean, truly, like I think the primary cause is probably just economics. That it's architects don't make oodles of money. Sorry, guys. And developing a project takes oodles of money. I would say architects, as we're trained, we're developed in terms of our skill set to do a lot of the things developers need to do. The one aspect that I think we miss out on quite a lot is the idea of gathering investors, putting together pro formas and things like that, which is all the stuff that I think a lot of people who are drawn to architecture end up really hating. But I don't think there's a good reason for it, and I actually think more architects probably should self-develop. And there's some good examples of that. What is it, Alloy in New York City? Is that the name of it? A great, weird little firm that is like a developer-architect combo, and they somehow make it work on their pro formas. They kind of get like one gem of an idea in each project and execute it really well, and they're super successful at it. So it's not impossible, and I do think it should happen more.
You know, I think it's a great question. I'll say I've developed in the tiniest little developments, but have bought 2 buildings for our office, one in Carrboro and then one in Durham. So at a very tiny scale. But it has helped me tremendously to work with the kind of clients that we do to help them through the process. Because it is something that scales, right? You need to find a site or a building. You might need to renovate it. You need to talk to the bank. You need to figure out if it has asbestos and it has to be abated. And so the process does scale pretty well. So I would encourage everybody to, when and if you're ready, because it has given me confidence, back to maybe Jen's question, to work with groups. Don't tell our liability insurance people, but you know, we help the many groups we work with put together their project budgets, which is what a developer or would tip, or a facilities manager at a university or so would do. We'll walk people through the process and tell them when they need to talk to a financial institution, et cetera. So it's been really helpful. And I mean, I've developed at the little tiny scale, but it has been really helpful in working with clients. So I think it's a great question.
Yeah, I think it's a great question too, and there's a lot of answers, but I think one thing I want to bring up is that our education system doesn't really teach us very well to be architect developers. In most schools, in all your studio projects, you're never given a budget. You're never asked to think about how much does this actually cost. Architects are kind of taught to just do whatever their mind comes up with, which I think is great. It's a great way to learn how to be creative and to come up with amazing ideas, but most of them are not feasible. So I think there is something we could do in education to really think more about the finances and where the most important places to put money to make a really good project. And hopefully that would lead to more architect developers.
I mean, it's a shot in the dark guess, but I mean, I think it's an education thing in terms of, a lot of people have no idea what architects do on a daily basis. We as architects really don't understand what developers do and what motivates them. We as architects have our own kind of, aesthetics and programmatic things that make sense to us, but oftentimes, BOMA calculations are diametrically opposed to what we think makes sense for, developing a building or building a building. So I think learning what really kind of drives development, because it's less about the economics, because a lot of developers don't have money. They figure out a way to access money. So I think it's less about the actual getting the capital, because I think there's ways to get it, but I think it's really about educating and learning about what is all involved in terms of development.
I do think that's key. I really like the idea of how do you bring that into our educational model to where it's not a set of logistics that drive the studio, but start to be part of the constraints that help us come up with more creative alternatives and solutions within the system, the way that it works, right? Like, we would love to say that we throw our current value system out the window and we come up with a new value system where there's no commodities, it's all about the communities, but that shit's not gonna happen. So how do we understand the way that it does work, and how do we work within that to bring in additional values to that system? And I wish I knew how to be a developer. That's on me to learn, right?
I just think that we're creative in every other aspect of practice, and I think we're well poised to be creative about how to become developers too.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a shame that we're not having this conversation after Dr. Tate, because I think he's got a lot to offer in this regard. But this is rhetorical, but I question when architects become entirely obsolete if they don't get at that table in more force than we have them there now. Sorry, that's a statement.
Yeah, no. There's some, like Vinny's here and Will Alphin's here. They also build a lot of their projects. Maybe they also have something to share, because I would also think, man, if you're a great designer, you design a cool house and you can, put it in budget, you'd have no problem selling it. But I don't know how easy that is in reality. I've never done that, but
It's really hard.
Megan, you had a question, and there's one in the back and one over here. So, Megan. Oh yeah.
I think and Will, you probably jump in on this. Building your own projects is extremely valuable, like Ellen says. You learn everything that you're supposed to know when you start to design. So if you can figure out how to build something for your mother, because you're not going to let her down, and find a way to make it happen through the city, the inspections, those kinds of things, it gives you these huge insights. I think being a developer, it's too late for some of us, but for everybody that's young in the room, you really need to save your money, and you got to figure out how to team up and get in the game, because we're kind of towards the end, not the end of our career, but it's so hard to get on the ladder of construction and buying things. It's kind of like that image where someone's kicking a can down the road. It's next 2 years, it's going to be even more expensive, and 5 years after that, it's going to be more expensive. So you really got to get in the game. And I think we use, I don't know about you, Will, but we use construction to be able to pay our bills. And our design fees are kind of we'll get paid when we get paid. So we kind of subsidize design. So we maybe wait a year to get paid our architecture fees because we're doing the construction. But you got to get in the game at some point. And I think once you don't need design fees, then you have a lot more influence. But that's really hard to get there. And so I'll leave it to you again.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. I mean, design build is a bit of a rare bird as well, and part of that is because designers and builders have different ways of thinking, I think. And so a lot of times, I think we go about it the hardest way possible, trying to design things and build things. And I think one of the things that we don't think about with developers, and I've had a little bit of experience with developers, is development is actually a full-time job as well. It's a whole skill set, it's a whole career path. These guys, these people, they invest in that as a career path, and I think we diminish how hard it is to be a developer by how casually we talk about them all the time. And I also remember Ken Bowers, who's the planner for the city of Raleigh, just saying, hey, these guys are cowboys. He can tell a developer, he can spot a developer in a room because they're risk takers. They walk in, they don't see the stuff we see. They don't see the risk we see. They don't see the rules we see. They're just there to solve problems and jump over hurdles. So I think it's it's a bit of a different mindset between someone who has to obey the code and design things and has all these intentions to developers, they come at it from a different angle.
Having worked on a lot of large-scale projects, I think you guys have really hit on some good points. Because I think as architects, we can choose our clients. And I would suggest, and this might not be so popular to say in the room, but developers might trust us less than we trust them in some regards. And I'm sure other people have had that experience. So you really have to work on developing the right relationships, I think, with the right clients. I try to make a kind of an analogy here. There might be a reason why architects aren't developers, and that is, doctors, for instance. There's a reason that you have general practitioners, and there's a reason you have surgeons. And so different forces, different knowledge coming together can really help you think in different ways. So I think rather than always hold your hand up to a developer and shut them out, I think one way is to invite them in and learn a little bit about what they do and how they do it and why they do it. Because if you choose the right developers for some of the reasons you guys have suggested, they have investment in their community. They care a lot. And I've been really fortunate to work for a number of large-scale developers that care about their community. They want to continue to build in their community. And if people see that they're doing good, thoughtful development, then they're going to get a chance to build again in their community. So I think there's a lot of complexity to the question. I think, Ellen, scale is one of those things. So from a large-scale development standpoint, one of the things that we always try to do is get in on the front end and try to help people plan the site, make the right choices, evaluate how big a footprint, where a building should go, how many buildings there should be. And also, we always try to bring something public to the project, give back a public plaza, give back artwork to the community that wasn't there before. So, I think rather than, and you're right, there are many developers who don't have that vision, but finding the right ones who have the vision and inviting them and learning from them would be an important aspect of what we could gain.
You go for it, Zach. You run this mic.
Jake mentioned that Durham is the model to follow, and I wish Phil Shostak was here tonight because he decided to become a developer in order to develop DPAC. So that's like a perfect example of you can actually do it. And I think in that, it is obviously a successful design. Also, in terms of education, the ULI has a great competition for students where, as architecture students, you work with business majors, and that's a great way to get involved in development. And then I also think, as an architect, it seems totally overwhelming to me too. I think it's important to be creative in ways other than aesthetics and space organization. The financial side, I think, always throws us off a bit, but it's also maybe an opportunity to work with developers, like Self-Help out of Durham also is a nonprofit developer, and so maybe there are more partnerships between architects and developers who are doing the kind of work that we want to do.
So I actually, just picking up on this conversation, I work for a small builder and developer here in Raleigh, and I guess I'm sort of the bad guy in the room, and I'm also kind of thinking about it from the other direction a little bit as well. I would say our firm is actually really interested in engaging with architects more. There's sort of a dearth, it seems to me, of people doing really creative infill work. And I think the biggest challenge that we face, one, is just kind of finding people that are down to like get nitty gritty on like pricing, because we try to build stuff that's more affordable, and sometimes it's hard to sort of like lasso budgets with architects that are thinking really creatively, and come up with like cool creative solutions that work. I don't necessarily think that architects need to become developers, but I think the partnership there could be really generative, because I think in some ways developing has the potential, like obviously, to do great kinds of evil, but it also has like a really cool potential to do a ton of really great impact work. Like we do a lot to try to, the people that are selling land are trying to get rid of land. A lot of times it's like entangled in different kind of weird wills and stuff like that. And so trying to help people that are selling the land get equity in the projects and stuff like that. So there's a lot of possibility there, all that to say. My question, if we're comfortable changing gears, is someone sort of jokingly mentioned like a sort of Hippocratic oath for architects, which kind of struck me as like just kind of an interesting idea, because there's been sort of a general sense of lament the past couple days, like, man, like there's a lot of bad things happening in the city, and like generally like we could be doing better with what seems to me kind of from the outside kind of an undeveloped sense of what better looks like, or could look like, or what it should look like, and then also just what are the responsibilities architects kind of generally have. Like, is there kind of a sense of conviction or story that the discipline is telling about itself and about its city that functions as like kind of a guiding framework to work within?
No. No, and there should be. I was actually thinking earlier this evening how cool it would be to have events like this and just invite the whole design community and try to like hash that out. Ellen can lead it with all the dots, and Eliza can put together the let us design the city kind of setup. But truly, I think that's a great question, and the fact that we as a community can all identify the issue and haven't really come up with kind of the path forward that we could recommend. There have been a few efforts in the past. Like Connections that happened a few years ago was an attempt to get at that, where you're taking a huge swath of land owned by the city and imagining how it could be used to sort of invest in the interests of people who really have a lot of needs in those areas. So there have been efforts like that, but I think collectively, you know, the creative potential in this room alone, and that doesn't account for all of the other really talented architects and designers in the Triangle, is remarkable. I mean, it's crazy how many designers and architects and really talented ones at that, and part of that's due to the school, architecture school, and there's a strong history of design and all that kind of stuff. But we really haven't put enough effort into sort of resolving what we think a future for Raleigh or Durham or the Triangle looks like. I do think on the question of if there can be like a Hippocratic oath, or Hippocratic, how do you pronounce that word? Somebody want to say that for me? I think that becomes complicated, and for architects there is like a health, safety, and welfare focused set of responsibilities that we have, that we take, you know, we legally take responsibility to do those things when we stamp a drawing and stuff like that. But even that, it feels like there's a lot to be desired in terms of what we have responsibility for. Because again, we're trained in school to think about a lot of things, and a lot of things beyond, you know, the building science of just health, safety, and welfare. So the answer is no, and that there should be. I think Raleigh in particular gets kind of we get talked about a lot as like a kind of sleepy town, and it's because there's not a lot of like righteous rage maybe or something. There's not a lot of people who, in the general public especially, who are speaking out about these things. And this also gets at an earlier point that Ed was talking about, but I think we do, in some regard, have a responsibility to be more vocal about these issues and collectively to kind of come together and start trying to define a future for Raleigh. So maybe in situ, that's the next project, is get everybody together and let us go ahead and design the rest of the city so that we don't have to deal with developers from Houston coming in and putting those buildings up.
I was just wondering if there is any public input that is ingrained in the design process for buildings such as these, that they might not necessarily inhabit on the interior, but they definitely interact with on the exterior, especially whenever they're being placed in these communities that have had a presence there historically. Is there any platform for them to give input on these designs, or and if not, should there be, and how can we make that happen?
I just wanted to know if, like, on top of that, is it just town hall meetings kind of thing, or is it like a door-to-door fundraiser? Kind of, how do you engage the community in these kind of situations?
Yeah, I'm not sure I heard Megan's part of the question, but I'll say in Durham, there has been a group for probably 25 years. They call them DAD, Durham Area Designers. And basically, they have taken on, when they see something, could be public project, could be a private project, that they think, and it's architects, landscape architects, planners, when they see something that they think could be done better, they poke it in the eye and they put out something in the paper that says, here's another idea, here's another way to do it. So I think there is precedent for some activism, whether you're asked or not. So that's kind of one example. But I also think that I know in Durham, there are many opportunities for charrettes on public projects, and I would say take advantage of those. Show up. You know, you got to be, for the Hamilton fans, which I know Davis is one. Right? You got to be in the room where it happens.
I think part of their question is, for a project like this that's on private land that a private developer's doing, is the public ever asked to give their opinion? Yes. Yeah, that's the question.
That I know of, but Dad gives their opinion anyway.
Yeah, I think you can. I mean, you know, like there was a couple of events held at that building, and the public came, and you know, to see it and to talk about it and to meet the guy who owned it, and to say why they wanted him to not tear it down. But at the end of the day, it's his property, it's his choice, and I don't necessarily think a design by public committee would be the way to alleviate that. You know, I think it's more of an education. I think if he realized he had a beautiful piece of history passed on, I don't think he bought that. I think it was in the family. It was passed on, and they rented it out. When it wasn't rentable, they wanted path of least resistance. Cheap building or economical construction that applies to the broadest general audience and doesn't ruffle any feathers. That was his mindset. It wasn't, this is actually a great building in Raleigh, maybe one of the top 10 buildings. I should find a way to save this building and to develop it and make it use for what the density I want to put there, but to keep it. You know, you see it in the warehouse district, that they tore down beautiful warehouses and they plop down things that don't look part of that district and don't address that district really. And there's a lot of opacity around that building and the space. There wasn't a public forum to say, you know, can we get more commercial space or more public space, or can that, you know, can you put the plaza on the other side where it's not going to be blasted in the sunlight all day? You know, that just doesn't exist. And I'm not sure, public projects do work like that to a certain extent, the bigger ones. I don't know, to be very honest, I feel like it's also quite challenging to have a design by committee and to try to listen to every voice, and, you know, I don't know if that's also the solution. I don't know, that's a tough question.
I agree that it would be multiple perspectives that would have to be like synthesized down into the design. But I do think that it's amazing to be educated and to educate people, but I also think that us as designers need to listen to the communities that we're gonna like be putting this into. So what do you guys think that we should start having these open forums for the community, or
A big part of our role as architects is to, well, let me sidestep. The first thing I did on the first day of architecture school is we went out into the community and we started talking about where is the edge between public space and private space. So I think part of the process in developing projects with a client on private land is educating the client, having a conversation with the client about having a relationship to the front of the building, to the public space, and there are varying shades of gray, right? Where you may own the building, you may own the inside, where is the edge of the public realm, and what is that role that the public realm and the public edge, what is the relationship of that, the streets, the people that use the community to engage with the building from how it looks, etc.
I hate to do this, but there are lots of hands raised. I see Jen's hand raised. I know Shiloh wanted to say something. We need to wrap it up for tonight. For me, one thing that I want to do is challenge all of us to think about the events we've had over the last 3 nights. One thing that's really been impressed upon me is that tonight, when the architecture panel is up here, we have mainly architects in the room. Last night, when we had people from the public up here who are invested in different issues in the city, we had mainly people from the city in the room. And never will the two meet. So I think we have a bigger problem that we need to be talking to each other. My main purpose in throwing myself under the bus last night was to just kind of say, hey, we're all complicated and we actually need to be more vulnerable with each other and talk to each other and be more involved with the different groups, right? So I hope that can be a bigger part of this. I think I want to end with a question for you guys, but before that, I want to make a shameless plug. There are 4 more events. These are the people who are coming. This is the last panel discussion. The next 4 events are more kind of traditional lectures. We've worked really hard to get some of the best architects in the world to come to Raleigh, and in one case to Zoom to Raleigh, to talk about the work they do. The next lecture, thank God we get a break tomorrow night, is on Thursday. Is Jonathan Tate from New Orleans, who has built an award-winning practice working on almost nothing but affordable housing, which our city is desperate for. On Friday night, we have Sekou Cook coming here, who wrote a really important book called Hip Hop Architecture. He's the incoming urban design director at UNC Charlotte. We're very fortunate to have him here in North Carolina. It will be intense. He's a very good speaker, and he hits hard. So I hope that everyone will come to that. On Saturday night over Zoom, easiest lecture you've ever attended. Literally turn on your computer in your pajamas. So easy. Is what we think will be a future Pritzker Prize-winning firm from Spain, Jaume Mayall from TEDA, who they are doing some of the most site-specific and relevant work in the world. And that one's super easy to get to. And then next Wednesday, Stella and David Betts will be giving a lecture about their work in New York. They are the most recent New York Firm of the Year award winners. They do a range of work. They do really expensive elite houses like we do, but they also do really interesting public non-building work in various formats. So I think these are all going to be really interesting lectures. I hope you guys will find the time to be there. Nick Neptune, who went to dinner with us last night, asked all of us who went to dinner a great question. By the way, I hope you guys will go to dinner afterwards. It's going to be fun. But asked us a great question last night, which is what in the next 5 years is the most important thing to have happen in Raleigh? I know some of you are from Durham, so you can answer for Durham. Or if you're from Durham and think Raleigh is awful, which it is, you should answer for Raleigh. But I'll just let each of you all kind of answer that on the way out. We'll clap you out. You popcorn style, it doesn't have to be in order. It's because I talked for too long. What needs to happen in Raleigh in the next 5 years? What's the thing?
I think this is for Durham and Raleigh, and I lived in Raleigh for a long time, and I loved it. And I don't know what it looks like, but public transportation.
I think a big thing for me that's already happening is like top tier companies to come here. They're going to bring smaller companies with them. They like to collaborate with them. There's going to be new industry and the education system is come up and have other opportunities just to describe that. So I think having that kind of stability economically is going to do a lot of good for those high jobs for the most part. I think having Nike, Apple, Google here trying is huge. I think that's a good thing. I think if they get public transportation, something like Apple's light rail system, 3 stops, Durham, Chapel Hill, Airport, Raleigh, that would really make a huge difference for a lot of other systems as well, but just having that growth is a good thing.
I think, I don't even know how to answer the question, but I would say, obviously there's a bunch of growth, there's a bunch of everything happening, but I think the importance of place, I hope that as much change and as much growth that happens, that people still remember, I don't know, not to get sappy, but like humanity and the premise of open space, and public spaces, places that have specificity and authenticity to this place. Because I think the thing that I hate about, it's happening in Durham as well, but in Raleigh, Charlotte, Atlanta, Houston, insert whatever name you want to name, is that it's all generic, it's all get out. And I think that is really unfortunate. And so I think we're still kind of teetering where we still have some identity that we can kind of retain to some level in terms of where we are as a region. So that's kind of my take.
Are we in?
I would just say our responsibility is one another. Like a lot of talk about today, how to get people conversation, no one's facing examples of the grassroots developments. Those are still very, what we've been talking about is such a narrow portion of our community here. So the interconnectivity, all of us, public transportation, our college, whatever, just our responsibility that we have to